thank you to Antonio, to Carlo, Paula, to everyone who's here, especially to Amalia and Wynnie. Thank you for the amazing invitation. I can also say that Il Posto is a really incredible space, and the time I spent there, I spent like just under 2 weeks in total, were unforgettable. It was really, really amazing. It felt like a discovery to me to be able to go to Chile and see this incredible collection. The idea for the exhibition, which I will go into now, it began by, I spent a lot of time as a student thinking about visibility and representation, particularly of artists from Latin America within the system of art and within its institutions. And when I received this invitation by Antonio, Sergio, Carlo, and Paula, I went to Santiago to meet them and to see the collection, and I had a conversation with Antonio and Sergio where we kind of shared our frustrations on how reductively work by non-Western artists, and in that specific conversation we were talking about works by artists of indigenous descent, how frustrated we were at how reductively their work is read and presented within particularly Western institutions, but also I think internationally. I think the process of accepting or absorbing indigenous art in the Western art world has a lot of parallels to the absorption that Latin American art had maybe in the 80s or the 90s, like a few decades ago, but where Latin American artists were allowed to participate within the Western sort of art system on the basis that there was something inherently Latin American about their work. A lot of work became about, like worshiping the sun and really silly things like that. And so, or not silly things, but like things that were extremely, extremely reductive and not true for the incredible heterogeneity that exists in Latin America. And this, of course, has not only happened to artists of indigenous descent or artists of Latin American descent, but artists of many subaltern identities and artists that think about and unpack and examine power dynamics in their work. So like I said, you're allowed to participate on the basis that your art is about your condition of marginalization. And these sort of institutional terms of visibility, which is what a performance artist and writer called Peggy Phelan called it in the 90s, or an institutional trap, as the curator Nav Hack called it, has led to a lot of art that I personally find a bit challenging and a little bit problematic. So the art market and art institutions have rewarded work that makes the condition of one's otherness puts the conditions of one's otherness front and center. And that has led to, I think, a lot of problematic self-othering, a lot of depictions of identity, which are very essentializing, rigid, and stereotyped. And also to a lot of work that is aesthetically stifling or stifled, I think, work that isn't particularly imaginative, a lot of figurative work, a lot of self-portraiture that doesn't kind of push any aesthetic boundaries, and that doesn't particularly make me, at least, very excited. And so this was just a conversation that Antonio and Sergio and I had, and I think this was a conversation, I think they had this conversation with me to make sure I don't fall into the same trap when I exhibit in Il Posto, but I kind of took that and decided this is what the exhibition is going to be about, which was a little bit challenging, because at times it felt like an essay more than an exhibition, and I think Antonio really helped me develop it into an exhibition. I hope you all agree by the end of this. So essentially the exhibition, I decided I wanted to focus on artists that express their own subjectivity or express a sense of identity, or that speak of very specific dynamics of power, such as gender, ethnicity, etc., but without succumbing to essentialism, without succumbing to binary thinking, without, kind of expressing their subjectivity in a way that is that recognizes our anarchic reality, that recognizes that we are in constant flux, that that identity and our sense of selves is relational and is always changing. And I wanted the exhibition to explore artists who did that, and I wanted it to explore what an aesthetics of complexity could look like. What is the best strategy to encompass that complexity? And so we decided to look at two particular moments within the history of Latin American art, the 1980s and our contemporary moment. And that is because those were two moments that we felt through research that the discourse of like identity politics were really protagonistic in discourses within the work that artists were making, the works that museums were doing, and the writing that curators were putting out. And so you'll find, as I go through these pictures, or I hope you'll find, in the 1980s, there's a lot of artists where the body was still very present. The 20th century was a particularly violent time in Latin American history. There were a lot of extremely violent and repressive dictatorships, and the body was the site of the body was what felt those consequences. And there was a lot of a lot of disappearances and things, and so the body was very present in the 80s. But then for the more contemporary work, which Wynnie and Amalia are a part of, I wanted to imagine what would it look like to go beyond the body, beyond visibility. What kind of new strategies have been created to think about the complexities of how we relate to one another and how that forms your own subjectivity. And so what I wanted to create was these almost like continuities and discontinuities where you saw works from the 80s that were very not so subtle, and I'll show you examples of some, and that were then, you saw the body almost vanishing or abstracting itself. And so the contemporary works focus a lot more on abstraction, strategies like abstraction, fiction, assemblage, and so that is more or less what this exhibition encompasses. And just to say the last little bit, the exhibition begins with a performance, a documentation of a performance by Las Yeguas del Apocalipsis, which is this performance art duo from Chile that made a lot of work about their dissident gender identity, about the AIDS epidemic, about a lot of very, I think, when we think about identity and identity politics, a lot of these categories that we traditionally think of, but their work is conceptually extremely dense. They represent themselves in a way that is in a constant flux, in a constant state of becoming rather than being. This constant. They describe their practice as a chameleonic exercise. They functioned as chameleons, and they always borrowed other people's clothes, other people's identities. And they played the role in Pedro Lemebel, who's one of my heroes and one of the people in this performance art duo. They played the role of the gay, of the South American, of the Indian, of the poor person. They played it to an extreme to kind of show its absurdity and show its rigidity. And so that is more or less what the exhibition is about, and it's divided into 3 sections, and the third section is called Cuerpos-Territorios, or body territories. And it looks at, I want to read what I wrote because it's a lot easier that way. So in my essay I sum up the section saying, so if the colonial conquest imposed artificial borders on the territory we now know as South America, it also imposed these models of control on the body, controlling and stereotyping the body's excesses and overflows. And so with that being said, I present, let me see if I can find Wynnie and that's, oh, you can't see Winnie's work there. That's Amalia's incredible work there, that these two here, and that's Paz Errázuriz's work, and then right around the corner we have Winnie's work. Right. Oh, this is the perfect view. Okay. So I put Amalia Paz Errázuriz, who is a photographer, and Wynnie in dialogue with one another. And I'm going to speak about the work specifically as we go along, but first, I really love the relationship between Wynnie and Paz, where Paz shows photographs of her friends who did not conform, I guess, to like binary forms of gender identification, and then Wynnie, your work shows these bodies that kind of collide and have, again, no specific gender identification, and one body collides into the other. They kind of, it's very hard to tell where one ends and one doesn't. And again, for me, this is like a really incredible representation of how, I guess, like, gender dissidence in general. But anyway, my first question for you, Wynnie, is, Pedro Lemebel, who is in Las Yeguas, talked about photography not being the correct medium to capture those with dissident gender identity. So Lemebel says that photography calls those people to order and it corrects them. So with this in mind, I wanted to ask what painting does for you that other media can't do. ¿Entendiste un poco? Para ti la pintura, ¿cuál es por qué escogiste pintura en vez de la fotografía? Más que nada, o sea, para ti, ¿cuál es la importancia de la pintura? Formalmente, no sé si culturalmente, pero y personalmente.
Para mí la pintura es un espacio de creación teórica. La performance, en este caso es un video de una acción que es una resignación sexual.
So for me, the painting is a theory. It's like a relation, like a theoretical relation, and also like in the performance, there is a movement and a vision of like a sexual, situation.
Resignment. Resignación.
Resignment.
Entonces la pintura se convierte en casi un libro abierto donde especulo y entonces construyo toda una teoría que voy a aplicar en la vida a través de una performance que va a convertirse en un video.
Okay, so in the painting, it's like an open book where you speculate and you create like this narrative that could be like a performance, or it could also be a performance.
En esta pieza que presenté que está en la colección de Il Posto, es una pintura que es en un acrílico transparente, que lo que hago es imaginar qué futuro es el que viene después de esta resignación sexual que yo misma creé a mi medida.
Okay, so in this painting that is part of Il Posto collection, which is an acrylic over a film of plastic, you create this situation where it's like this sexual like moment of resignment that you create like this narrative and how it can go further.
La pieza es parte de una exhibición que se llama Closing to Open, que significa, cerrando para abrir, que es cerrar las 3/4 partes de mi vagina para no poder ser penetrada ni ser útil creando hijos o maternar o tener un...
Okay, so this the painting closing the 4 parts is about like closing vagina, not to being penetrating and not being like able to procreate, like this kind of symbolism.
Entonces la pintura se convierte en un espacio para imaginar qué sucedería con mi cuerpo después. Por eso es importante para mí la pintura, porque es un ejercicio del día a día, a diferencia del performance, que tengo mucho más claro lo que planeo y voy a desarrollar, ¿no?
So for you, the painting is really important because it's a thinking of what is happening after the narrative, after what you're creating.
Y en esta pintura especialmente...
Yeah, and it's part of your everyday practice. Thank you.
Y en esta pintura es un cuerpo que no tiene sexo, sin sexo, y que se va derritiendo dentro de su propia imagen.
Okay, and in this painting there is a sexual, like a painting without sex that is starting to melt in the proper image.
Sí.
In its proper image.
And I think that's something... Gracias, Wynnie. Gracias, Jaro. I think that's something that... a way that you could describe Paz's images as well, who, she documented her friends who, again, were of gender dissident identity and were sex workers, and there's something really beautiful I think about that portraiture next to Wynnie's work, which is somewhere in between portraiture and landscape, and somewhere in between abstraction and figuration as well. And so I really wanted to put them in dialogue with Amalia's work, which is called Catacresis, and it looks at the gaps in knowledge that we have, and or for me at least, the way that I interpreted these works, and you can tell me I'm wrong, but the way that I was really interested in thinking about these works was thinking about how we fill the gaps in knowledge that we have with our own biases, our own understandings, our own forms of knowledge. So she creates these quasi-bodies, these like really uncanny constructions and assemblages, and that call to mind bodies that you almost want to call them bodies but aren't, and the word quasi, which I know you named one of your exhibitions, that I think is like so perfect, and names them after like the objects. So the legs of the chair, we have no name for these things, so we use the knowledge that we have, particularly with our body, or in the one on the left, the neck of a bottle. And so it felt really pertinent to put those in contact in dialogue with Wynnie and with Paz, these bodies that at least modern Western thinking doesn't have words for, is only beginning to create language for. And it felt like a very pertinent dialogue to me. But anyway, I wanted to ask Amalia, very generally, just to introduce the series, what was your impulse to create these like very, very uncanny structures? And did you ever expect it to be read in the light of, I guess, like gender or body politics?
Does this work? Yeah. Hi. First of all, I want to say you're wrong, just because I want to say it, but you're not wrong. But there is a thing that maybe it's important to say, is that the title of the series, Catacresis, is a literary term that that it is basically a type of metaphor in which a word from a certain discipline gets used in another context because there's a lack of expression to name that thing. So a leg of a chair is a catacresis in that it is a metaphor that comes from the human or the animal body into the world of furniture to name that bit of the chair. But the thing is, because there isn't any other names for that bit of the chair, we forget it's a metaphor, and it just becomes the name for the leg of the chair. And so what the series is basically an inventory of things that are named with these expressions, all of which, coincidentally or not, have to do with the body. So the tongue of the shoe, the leg of the chair, the heel of the club, I think, the back of the chair. There's needles with eyes, and there are clocks with faces, and books with spines, and all kinds of things. And so there's also, so I just wanted to say that's a bit of information. When you see the caption of the work or the label of the work, it says that it's called Catacresis, and then it's a list of the metaphors or of the objects that are, of the ingredients of the sculptures. And then those are put together in these sort of whimsical assemblages, but that they also, as you say, have this sort of animated quality to them, or look a little bit like creatures. And obviously you can just encounter them and not know anything about catacresis, and not have read the title and not know any of this, but they still have this sort of quasi-creaturesque quality to them. And I think it is because I don't think it's some sort of magical operation by which something that I'm thinking about people are sort of getting, but I think it's because we kind of do the same thing when we look than when we speak. We project images of our own bodies, so we like sometimes lie in the grass and look at the sky and look at a cloud and think, oh, that looks like a face. Or like often it will be something that relates to our body. And So it goes from language to form, and then from form to maybe language again, in which we're trying to name the mass creatures in our mind. Another thing that I wanted to say when you were talking about sort of Western values of the body is that the first time I encountered the definition of a catachresis is in a novel by Bolaño, which is a Chilean writer, but by coincidence, in which there's this moment in the Savage Detectives, which maybe many of you have read, in which there's a group of people that are racing out of the city towards the desert in a car, and the situation is quite stressful, and so to pass the time while there's this sort of chase going on, the people in the car are having a conversation, and the conversation is between a group of self-made poets that sort of reject notions of the academic, if you want, in literature. And this kid, who is a wannabe poet, who is the hero of the novel, but also who has actually attended university and has studied all these things. And he's basically testing these poets in the knowledge that they have of these literary expressions. So I don't know, it doesn't have exactly to do with it, but there's a sort of a relationship to the canon of naming something and encountering something that is definitely there. And then there's also that sort of visual relationship to Dadaism or the absurd or the surreal that we also have from canons of art history, if you want. So obviously the relationship with the body is that of like encountering, and there is, if you want, something of the queer, in that they are these sort of newly acquired forms of what is possible in terms of a body, but it's definitely a good or surprising twist for them to be in this context, for sure. Sorry, that was a long answer.
That was great. I kind of want to continue on that, and you have kind of answered it, but yeah, like we talked about, it's a series that looks at the gaps left by the economics of language, which is a quote, and I'm not sure who wrote that quote, but it's in my research from earlier this summer, and how we fill those gaps with our own intimate references, particularly in this case, our understanding of our own bodies. Similarly, Wynnie's work depicts these bodies that kind of exceed our very heteronormative and patriarchal bounds of understanding, and bodies for which, like I mentioned earlier, kind of modern Western culture is only beginning to develop a language for. And so thinking about language not being enough, I wanted to ask, do you feel like your work in the visual for both of you can fill these gaps? Do you think that the visual can do something that spoken or written word can't do? Why are you an artist and not a writer?
I think in particular in my practice, it's a little bit about pushing the two aspects in parallel so that they can further each other. So I don't see the gaps as a lack, but as an opportunity. So let's say, I don't know, in very simple terms, you're sitting there and you're wondering whether something should be red or yellow, and then you paint it in a particular way, and then that makes you think of something. And then that thing that you thought makes you change the object that you're working on in a different way. And then the way that an object looks is surprising to you, and when you're trying to look for words to express it, that will take your mind somewhere else. So there's this sort of dialogue between what isn't possible to be spoken, because you can only speak around the thing, but also what isn't possible to be seen.
So they do two different things.
They do two different things, and in my case, what my practice is basically constantly trying to bridge that gap, or push them together so that my mind doesn't run too far from the thing that I'm thinking about, or the thing doesn't run too far so that I don't know what I'm making it. Which can happen.
No. Estábamos hablando de que para mí la muestra, estas obras de Amalia hablan un poco sobre partes de, o sea,
como los vacíos, como
los vacíos que el lenguaje no puede cubrir. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿para ti lo visual tiene algo que el lenguaje no puede cubrir, que el lenguaje no tiene? Sí, más o menos eso, no sé si...
Pienso que yo trabajo con mi vida y o sea, con las acciones, pero también como el arte como una herramienta de terapia y de cambio para la vida, ¿no?
I work with, like, the art for me is a way, a tool of working with the change and like a way of therapy.
Y para mí la escritura o el lenguaje en general tiene algunos límites, ¿no?
And language and writing has some limits.
Por ejemplo, el último proyecto que elaboré es acerca del VIH y podría tal vez el lenguaje hablar acerca de las nuevas actualizaciones médicas acerca del VIH, de todos los prejuicios que el VIH tiene consigo.
For example, in my last work, I did a research and I spoke about like HIV, sorry, disease, and it could have been easier to use language and use writing to do this research, but instead.
Pero en este caso creo que el arte genera una malla mucho más amplia que lo sostiene todo, ¿no?
But in this case, art was a bigger supporter for this and to express.
Por ejemplo, dentro de la exhibición presento una metáfora acerca de mi cuerpo.
Like in the exhibition, I present a metaphor about my body.
Donde los visitantes son los virus, son como virus que ingresan a mi cuerpo.
Where the visitors are the virus that are visiting my body.
Y se contaminan y me contaminan.
And the visitors contaminating you, and and they get contaminated as well.
Y mi cuerpo es como un arma de acción.
And,
Creo que sí,
and your body is like
como un arma.
The weapon. Yeah.
Y creo que esto hace que el lenguaje, el arte sea mucho más complejo, ¿no? Atraviesa diferentes tipos de significados, ¿no?
Yeah, and in this way the artwork is more powerful and goes through all those.
No solamente se trata de contar una historia.
It's not only about talking about a narrative.
Como lo puede hacer el lenguaje.
As the same way as language does.
But you could argue that poetry does too, ¿no? La poesía también hace eso. Es simplemente como si utilizas el lenguaje a nivel investigativo, pero también, en la poesía también hay como estos gaps, ¿no? De los que tú hablabas.
Amalia is saying that poetry could arguably do the same thing that Wynnie's.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. O sea, me estoy preguntando, porque tú también escribes, ¿no? O piensas.
Pero lo que me interesa es, dentro del arte, que el espectador puede ser también un agente que introduce significados y modifica los significados, ¿no? Uno crea ciertos significados con la intención de comunicar ciertas cosas, pero es el espectador al final el que decide y modifica en el espacio los significados, que eso me parece súper interesante dentro del arte.
I'm just going to translate it. But so when you say that it's what she thinks that is in art, you also have the spectator who sort of completes or takes further those meanings that you might try to create as an artist. So you're trying to say something as an artist, but actually you can never kind of anticipate or what people are going to do with it or make of it is always unexpected. And so therefore it's taken. Well, she's asking me what I think. I don't know, it's like an endless game, because you could argue that a reader could do that too, you know? So I think it's more about where you yourself as a maker find that space. I think some people can find it in language, but it's true that in Wynnie's case, or also in my case, the presence of another body is so important, and there's something quite sort of non-bodily about language. No?
Which is actually, that's a perfect segue to the next question, because a lot of this, que hay algo que con la presencia del cuerpo que no, tal vez no existe en la lectura, en el lenguaje, que sí existe cuando estás con una obra de arte. And so my next question is about the role of the body. This section is obviously so much about the body, its relation to the territory, how certain man-made sort of artificial impositions on the territory have also been made, or there's continuities between that and impositions on the body. And so my question is a more general question about your practice, but what role does your body play in making your work, in terms of seeing, in terms of touching, in terms of feeling? ¿Qué rol juega tu cuerpo en la creación de tus obras?
En mi caso, el cuerpo es un espacio mi cuerpo es mi espacio de investigación como tal. En mi cuerpo enfrento ensayo y error y también mucha incertidumbre, ¿no?
Yeah, my body is the place where I research, and my body is the place where the errors and the good things happen.
Creo que soy una narradora de historias dentro de mi trabajo. He entendido la historia como una serie de eventos no necesariamente reales que están inscritos y que modelan la vida. La historia del arte y la historia de la humanidad en general.
Yeah, being like your body is like a way of narrating stories, and stories about yourself and stories about history.
Y me interesa con mi cuerpo cambiar esas historias que están narradas.
And how to change all those narratives within your body, with the body.
Changing those narratives with her body, like through the narratives of history, the narratives of the history of art, with her body. So kind of like her body as this laboratory that she uses to change history, which is cool.
Am I supposed to answer this question?
If you want.
Well, I think in the body as such isn't like a central theme as it is for Wynnie. So that's clear, no? Like in Wynnie is her own like body that is there, but it's also, I think, maybe your question is angled to also like that sort of more direct relationship with painting that a body making a mark has. In my case, I feel like my practice is more ethereal or immaterial, but it's definitely a direct consequence of the physical environment. So I've sort of moved a lot, and you know, I think artists, not just me, we live in quite precarious circumstances, and this idea that we all have big studios and make big bulky things isn't always sustainable. And for me, that became a good problem, if you want. Like, I didn't want to live in a small house and make huge sculptures. I studied sculpture in a very academic art school in Buenos Aires. And you know, it was sculpture was very much about making big bulky things and lifting heavy, and it was very male dominated. It was very much about sort of almost like sports. And as a result, I was like, lift it. And then as a result, I was like, I can't make any of this. I don't want to lift any of this. I don't want to lug it around. I sort of became really like almost like phobic about having things and creating things. And if you really, really, really think about it, if you like think about it really hard, there's no reason to make anything. And every time you make something and the things are there and they don't go anywhere, they sort of stare at you. And they remind you of this sort of ridiculous idea that making things is a good idea, which I do think it is, but it's just that. So I think a lot of my practice is almost like a reaction to then the things that I make having a body and then having to share space with them or look for storage solutions. Or obviously, as I grew older and had, I've been lucky. I've been invited to do things. I do have a studio which has central heating, which in London is kind of like after 10 years. I have one with heating, but it does mean that I am braver about making things now. But it did take me a while to be able to make that choice in a way that it didn't feel like threatening to my body without wanting to be dramatic about it. But
yeah, no, but it can be threatening. I feel, and I think I wanted to ask both of you that question because Wynnie's work is very expressive and gestural, and yours is, like you said, more immaterial, but also features other people's bodies in a way.
This I think is very important. I was thinking about it in relationship to Wynnie's work, because I think Wynnie has been very brave, que ha sido súper valiente con esa relación con tu propio cuerpo, with her own body. I really chickened out when I started seeing. I performed a little bit in my earlier works myself, and then I would see an image of myself, and I would look at it and would think totally the wrong things. Like, I look a bit fat. I don't look so nice in that image. Like things that I never think about other people. But within mine, I had sort of interjected all these sort of fucked up ways of looking at a woman's body. And because there's a history of the woman's body being turned into an image. So for me, I just took the easier way out, which was like, I'm just going to ask other people to perform. Because honestly, whenever I look at people, I think everybody's beautiful, and I don't have to think about it, and I can concentrate in the work. And then that became sort of something I could ask others to do. And I became much more comfortable with that position.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm going to ask one last question, but and then we'll open up because I think it's been more than an hour now. But I was going to say that both of your works deal with important, sometimes heavy, sometimes dense themes, and your work is, Amalia, often about like politics and form, and language and form, like we explored today. Wynnie, your work explores a lot of sort of patriarchal and heteronormative violence that is opposed on certain bodies. And so despite that, there's still, like you talked about before, there's whimsy in your work, Amalia, even though we're dealing with serious subjects. In Wynnie, in your work, there's catharsis. There's a lot of joy in both your works, is what I'm trying to say. And so I wanted to ask, to leave on a bright note, talk to me about joy and art, and do you think it's important to have joy in art in your practice? Siento que hay catarsis, hay como que un sentido de alegría y placer.
Creo que en el contexto en general latinoamericano y peruano, que es lo que voy a hablar, en general pienso que vivimos momentos difíciles, complicados, pero también es interesante dentro de mi trabajo, no lo he mencionado, pero lo voy a decir y voy a llegar al punto de la alegría, es hablar acerca de la ilegalidad. O sea, trabajar a través de la ilegalidad dentro de Latinoamérica abre muchos caminos, ¿sabes?
Rooting a little bit this answer in the Latin American context, especially in the one in Peru, the one about like it's like a difficult context, but also like speaking her work through the illegality of things.
Y dentro de mis diferentes proyectos que he elaborado, hay alegría en manifestar la libertad de decidir, ¿sabes?
And among all the works she did, there is all this joyful of manifesting the freedom of choosing.
Aunque las leyes no estén hechas a la medida.
although there's no laws done on that kind of
En
way.
el caso de esta última, en la exhibición de Closing to Open, la imagen central era un video donde ofrecía una cirugía, ¿no? Se veía una cirugía plástica dolorosa.
In the exhibition Closing to Open, there was a graphic image of her surgery,
Estaban pasando muchas imágenes radicales dentro de la exposición.
and there was lots of radical images happening on that exhibition,
Pero,
and painful ones because it was, the surgery.
pero la exhibición era un festejo
But although that,
de una nueva iniciación, ¿no?
the exhibition was a joyful and was like a farewell of like a new, no farewell, sorry, a joyful thing.
Entonces creo que en general la felicidad dentro de este contexto latinoamericano estaba en romper los límites y crear en libertad lo que yo decidía en ese momento.
Yeah, all about this joyfulness. It was about breaking and celebrating the freedom.
Y creo que en el paralelo el arte tiene esa posibilidad, ¿no?
And in parallel, like the arts has this possibility.
Porque el arte intenta comunicar y en ese intento de comunicar hay esperanza, ¿no?
Yeah, and in this way, like arts communicates, and in this way of trying to communicate, there is a lot of hope.
Wynnie is talking about a specific exhibition where there is a video in which they record themselves having surgery and their vagina essentially getting closed up, and they talk about the joy of illegality. Peru has really archaic laws about people's bodies and who they are allowed to love and marry, and so they, despite it being a very painful image, a very radical image, they're saying that there was a lot of joy in that transgression, and the closing of that part of their body actually opened up a lot of new possibilities and ways of thinking, and so ultimately it was a joyful and transgressive body of work.
Yeah, for me it's quite moving to hear you say that thing about this desire that we have as artists to communicate and how that's hopeful, because I feel like I've also, a lot of my practice has been rooted in that, so it's nice to find that connection, this sort of huge effort that we make to talk to one another, even though like often we don't reach conclusions. In my case, I feel that I think in my work, but also in my life, humor is essential, or finding joy is essential to surviving. But also, I've sort of wondered, even through some works, whether it can be a form of resistance, that joy or enjoying something can actually be the form in which we resist oppression. But besides that, I think in a sort of a milder way, for me, humor, specifically in the work, is a quest for complicity. So when somebody gets a joke or understands that something funny, it's a form of communication, but and in particular it's a very sort of intimate and positive form of communication, and I feel in my work specifically relates to, if you want, my politics, in that I am often in search of the conciliatory, and I think humor can do that. Humor can generate complicities across ideology even, so it can be the beginning of a conversation, or it can be the thing that oils the wheels so that conversations can get unstuck, or so that's why I personally find it important in the work specifically.
Yeah, if anyone if anyone wants to ask anything, feel free. We'll pass the mic around. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Question? Anyone? No?
I want to know, you mentioned that normally the narrative of Latin American art is a bit reductive with regards to like indigenous art, correct?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to know what was your thoughts on, let's say, the Venice Biennale and Adriano Pedrosa's curation, and like the presence of a lot more, let's say, indigenous artists, and if maybe that's a small change, let's say, a beginning of change.
Yeah, I still don't know what I think about. ¿Fueron a la Bienal ustedes? Okay. I still don't know what I think about it, but I felt exhilarated to see a lot of artists that were really important references for me, that a lot of my colleagues weren't aware of. To see them in this space felt like a step towards a positive change. But like every exhibition, I think it had its positives and it's, yeah, in some places it failed. There were too many artists. I feel like it was like 350 artists is a lot of artists. I think they needed more space to breathe, but it was yeah, I enjoyed it.
Any other questions?
Maybe we can go for a drink.
Yeah, we can go for a drink, and well, thank you everyone for being here. And I would like to especially thank to Sarah for being with us for the last 2 weeks, and also Delfina Foundation for hosting us and being so generous. So please everyone have a nice time and drink some Chilean wine and some Chilean empanadas. Yeah, please. And Wynnie, Amalia, Wynnie traveled from the Netherlands to be here, so thank you, Carolina. Also, thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the empanadas, for the delicious little desserts that there are, and for the wine. And we've got about half an hour to mingle, meet, chat, and then just after 8 o'clock we're going to start.